So in general, the Final Fantasy series is known for its fairly modular game design. Each entry in the franchise is its own story with its own unique characters and world that is completely independent from the rest of the series. However, some games in the series reach a level of popularity where fans want to know what happened next, or, in some cases, what happened before. How did the events of this game come to pass? Of all the games in the series, the one that has the most media created about it is that of Final Fantasy VII, which should come as no surprise. It is by far the most popular game in the series, and is currently in the middle of releasing a 3-part remake of the original game. And with that, there's come some interest in seeing some other Final Fantasy VII media re-released. The first of these that we came to see was Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion. Crisis Core is one of those more interesting games to look at in the franchise. Originally released in Japan on the PlayStation Portable in 2007, and then later in the West the following year, this game is arguably the most well-liked of the various Final Fantasy VII projects. And there's good reason for it. There is a fairly good narrative here, even if the gameplay doesn't hold up perfectly in all regards. So today we're going to take a look at this remake and look at the various ways it improved on the original 2008 release. So probably the first place to start with this is, how exactly does this game play? Is it a turn-based RPG, an action RPG? What is it? So the game I would say is probably the most comparable to this would be Kingdom Hearts, minus the kind of insane verticality that those games tend to be known for. The combat is in real time, but you are, in a sense, navigating a menu to select commands. While in the original games you had all your commands in this menu that you selected with the shoulder buttons, this game improves it by adding a fair number of hotkeys that make accessing your various moves fairly easy. Sort of similar to Kingdom Hearts, the combat can feel like it's not that deep compared to other action games. There are no light or strong attacks in this game like we see in other action games. So you're a bit limited in how exactly you attack, but you make up for it in having various abilities that you can use. And I will say, through my playthroughs of Crisis Core, I definitely use those other abilities far more than I use my other abilities in Kingdom Hearts. And because this is a Final Fantasy VII game, the materia system comes into play here, albeit quite a bit different than how it was in the original. Instead of having multiple abilities that you learn as you level up the materia, each materia contains at most one move, with some materia trading the moves for some sort of passive effect. These materia can then be leveled up, which either amplifies the effect or powers up the move that you use. And since a lot of lower level spells will eventually lose some of their efficacy as the game goes on, the game gives you something to do with them in the materia fusion system, which allows you to take two independent materia and fuse them into a new one. In some cases, you might combine two of the same materia just to produce a better stat effect. In others, you can take some of your mastered materia to upgrade them to a more powerful version. And in some cases, you can take a passive materia and fuse it with a command materia to create a version that has both that passive effect and the command move on it, allowing you to work within your limitation of 6 usable materia. Now that we've gotten that out of the way though, let's talk about some of the more controversial aspects of the game. So while you're playing, you might notice these slots spinning in the top left corner. This is what's known as the digital mind wave. This is effectively the game's limit break system, giving you access to various powerful moves at random times. You can also get effects like buffs and cases where your MP cost for an ability is completely nulled out for a set amount of time. This is also how you level up both your character and your equipment, which can seem a little weird because, like, in an RPG, normally you progress through an experience system, so what gives? So, as this game points out in its tutorials, and as data mines have found in the back end of the code, there is an experience system that you get from defeating enemies, and the game uses that experience you gain to track an internal version of your level. This is then used to increase your odds of getting a level up in the DMW. So it's not exactly a true random, and the more experience you accumulate, the more likely you are to level up while in combat. Another major improvement to the DMW system is that while the original would often stop you to enter the modulating phase, this game instead removes a lot of that, having it all happen in the background and then giving you a prompt to use your abilities once they're available. The other aspect that I noticed replaying this game all these years later is how kind of constrained and small the game can feel at times. So granted, this is not entirely the fault of the development team. So just to remind you, this game was originally developed to run on this. So, like, it had to be designed in order to fit the constraints that this hardware allows for. So we got these more segmented out, smaller areas compared to the bigger ones on the series' console counterparts. And perhaps drawing a little too much from Kingdom Hearts, you don't see enemies actively on the map while you're exploring. Instead, they will pop up seemingly randomly, but I'm not quite sure if it's truly random. But either way, you're walking around and these enemies sort of just randomly pop in and you're brought into a battle. It's not necessarily a bad thing, and again, keep in mind both the platform it released on and the fact that the idea of completely axing random encounters was still sort of in the process of happening. It wouldn't have been for many, many years that Dragon Quest, for example, finally axed their random encounters. And while the story itself is quite short, there's quite a bit of content in this game for you to sink your teeth in if you so desire. This game contains a ton, and I mean a ton of optional missions that provide hours of additional content for you to enjoy. And these missions aren't necessarily something you can just ignore. There are a lot of benefits from completing certain missions. For example, the ones that provide you with the various summons, which I'll let you know now are kinda helpful. Like, the summons coming in at random times to help you out of a random fight are super helpful, and they can take a decent chunk out of a boss's health bar. So, like, definitely do that. That being said, though, a lot of the missions sort of devolve into a very similar rhythm, where you just explore an area until you find a certain monster and defeat that particular encounter. The only exception to that really are the boss fights. So there's a lot of content, but it can be a little bit repetitive if you ask me. Beyond just the base gameplay experience, there's a few other things that this game does to improve upon the original. The biggest improvement, I would say, is in the visual department. So obviously, releasing on the PSP, the game was limited to a fairly low resolution. This game gives the original a complete makeover, complete with completely new models that make the game look so good, especially on the PlayStation 5. However, as a product of its time, the game still does retain its full motion videos from the original, and sometimes the lips can be notably desynced from the character models. And part of that is because these scenes were not originally voiced. That being said, though, the game's full motion videos still actually look pretty good, despite the fact they were released on a console that didn't have all that much power. The visuals are also slightly held back due to the fact that this game was also released on the Switch, which means that the game could be made to look super, super pretty on the PlayStation 5, but also needed to be made in a way that could be easily scaled down for Nintendo's much less powerful console. This game also remasters its entire sound, bringing in an entirely new voice cast with many characters reprising their roles from the remake, as well as a new remix soundtrack, which does the original PlayStation Portable soundtrack justice while giving it a much more clean sound. And lastly, onto the story, because I've been a little remiss to talk about what exactly this game is about. So for those of you who've only played the remake, you might have questioned who exactly is that guy with the black hair that appeared suddenly at the ending. This, my friends, is Zack Fair, a fairly minor character in the original who was fleshed out a lot in this game. And just a little warning, I'm about to tread into territory from the original game that has yet to be covered in the remake. So don't say I didn't warn you. So for those of you who don't know, Cloud isn't exactly who he says he is at the beginning of the game. Cloud, in fact, never made Soldier, and a lot of his memories as a member of Soldier, but instead belong to none other than Zack. So Zack starts the game as a member of Soldier in the second class, as it's called. He's a fairly young, bright-eyed guy filled with a ton of optimism, and in fact, certain characters in the game describe him as a bit of a puppy, something that he doesn't take too kindly to. The best way to describe this game, honestly, is that it's a bit of a coming-of-age story. So the original Final Fantasy VII was kind of known for its older characters. So while most JRPGs have like 15, 16, 17-year-old protagonists, FF7's characters start in their 20s and in some cases trend quite a bit older. This game, however, brings us back to what we're more used to from the JRPG genre. Zack is quite young in this game. In fact, he's only 16, which is something that I picked up as being a little bit more weird this time around than I did when I was younger. So I was about 14 when I played the game, and it didn't faze me that Zack was 16 at the time, but now I go back and I'm like, wow, he's very young, and they're basically sending him off to war. Now granted, 16 is only 2 years younger than the age of enlistment in countries like the US, but still. This game also features a 14-year-old Cloud who is a member of the Shinra army, which is again, really, really young. And while some people grow tired of seeing teenagers save the world, I think the character's youth here actually works to the game's advantage. Because if you have a character who's very young at the start of the story, you can sort of have this more optimistic character and then develop them to become a lot more jaded and begin to question the values they used to hold for granted. So, as you might have noticed, in the original game, Shinra are, for all intents and purposes, the bad guys of the story, and here you're playing as a member of Shinra. So like, what gives? And that's part of what sort of makes this game kind of brilliant, is that at the start of the game, Zack is very convinced that what he's doing and what Shinra stands for is right. But as the game develops and he starts to learn more about the various aspects that the company does, he begins to lose that faith. However, doesn't seem to quite let go of his dreams and aspirations in doing so. Some of my favorite interactions in the game, in fact, come from cases where Zack interacts with the people of the slums who maybe have a less than stellar opinion of the Shinra company. In fact, some of the people you interact with on the top level of Midgar don't look too highly on them either. We also have a mission fairly early on where we watch Shinra basically just blow a town off the map, which is kind of insane. And that's really his first indication that something is off. So beyond just that, a pretty central theme to this game is this idea of following your dreams. It is the central thing that Zack is asked about at the start of the game, and permeates a lot of the narrative. So Zack's initial dream is to, as he states it,
to become a hero.
Ah, good. Unattainable dreams are the best kind.
Thanks?
And so we see, as part of that, Zack begin to wrestle with what exactly does heroism mean? What does it mean to be a hero? And how is that different than how heroism might have been explained to him when he was younger? The aspect that really pushes Zack to question this is watching the fall of 3 members of Soldier. One of them, of course, being Sephiroth, the other being 2 wholly original characters. One of them being the game's main antagonist, Genesis, and the last one being the character of Angeal, Zack's mentor and the original wielder of the Buster Sword. Angeal is the main catalyst for Zack's character development. Angeal's big focus as a character is this idea of protecting your honor, which is something that he tries to maintain and pass on to Zack even in his final moments. And speaking of those final moments, one last major theme of this game is the idea of legacy. So obviously at the start of Final Fantasy VII, we see Cloud in possession of the Buster Sword. But at the start of this game, we see Angeal in possession of it, only for him to then pass it on to Zack at the midpoint, who then later passes it on to Cloud at the very end. So essentially, this game is equally about that sword and its significance as it is about the characters in it. Zack inherits a lot of Angeal's legacy, and in many cases begins to take on his role and even changes his hair to be somewhat similar to that of his former mentor. And he carries that idea of honor and following your dream along with him when he eventually passes the Buster Sword off to Cloud in his final moments, creating a sort of poetic ending for both of its previous wielders. With that idea of legacy, though, we also see characters in more prolific places fall from grace, Sephiroth being the main case. So a huge part of Final Fantasy VII's story revolves around this alien creature known as Jenova. Originally mistaken for an ancient by the scientists of Shinra, this life form was used to fuel several projects, notably Project G, which created Angeal and Genesis, and Project S, which created Sephiroth. Project G was in many ways considered to be a failure, as the 2 creations of that project eventually began to degrade as their bodies didn't quite fully accept Jenova's cells. And this is part of what drives the plot forward, is that Genesis is trying to stop his degradation and get back at the Shinra company for making him like that. A big thing that's brought into question fairly early on is what exactly does it mean to be human when you're created essentially to kill? This is a similar question that we see in shows like Star Wars: The Clone Wars, where we see an army of millions of identical soldiers bred to fight who have distinct personalities. Here we see as the bodies of characters like Genesis and Angeal begin to degrade, and they begin to exhibit some more non-human characteristics, that they begin to question, are they truly human or are, as they put it, a monster? Something which plays in pretty majorly into this game's depiction of the Nibelheim incident. We get to see a version of Sephiroth who is fairly reasonable and is actually a good guy for most of the game's story, have a major breakdown upon the revelations of where exactly he came from and what he was created for. It's something that gives him a lot more personality as a villain other than the guy who sort of went crazy one day. And it shows how you can be one of the most revered people in the world, but still not be doing okay and have a fall from grace because of it. Now, granted, most people who do that don't then try to destroy the world, but that's a different topic for a different day. Overall, though, Crisis Core is a very, very interesting story with a lot of layers that makes for an absolutely phenomenal experience, even if it does carry some dated aspects from the original into the current generation. It's a game that if you are interested in the world of Final Fantasy VII at all, I highly, highly recommend.